So welcome to our Managing Through Crisis Summer Series presented by Michigan State University's Broad College of Business. My name is Marcie Stowell, the Assistant Director of Executive Development at MSU. My role today is to moderate this session, sharing your questions with Dr. Dustin Carnahan, the presenter. As we begin here, here's a quick orientation to the webinar today. So on the slide, you will see we will start with a presentation from Dr. Carnahan, followed by a 30-minute Q&A period. So please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit your questions throughout the presentation. I will share as many questions as I can with Dr. Carnahan until we conclude at 2 p.m. today. So after we conclude, we will provide you a link to the recording of the webinar, which will be posted on the Broad College YouTube channel. So now I am pleased to introduce you to Dr. Dustin Carnahan. Professor Carnahan, my team and I are really looking forward to learning from you today, and I'm sure the participants are as well. So thank you for being a part of our summer series and sharing your insights on misinformation and our potential responses to it.
Well, thank you very much for having me. When you reached out with the invitation to join this webinar, I thought this is a really fascinating area for exploration because usually, and give a little background on me, I'm trained in political science. I work in the Department of Communication at MSU, and a lot of my focus is on misinformation in those kind of areas, those realms, if you will. And I hadn't really thought a lot about the ways in which misinformation could have really important impacts in the areas of business, in the areas of industry. And so I think I learned a lot just from thinking about the ways in which a lot of my research, a lot of things that we talk about in this literature could apply and be relevant to the business sector. And so to kind of give people a little bit of an overview into kind of what we're talking about misinformation. We're talking about things that are either untrue, unverified, unsubstantiated, any content that really has no evidentiary support. Oftentimes you'll hear this distinction between misinformation and disinformation, and the key distinction between those is disinformation is misinformation that's spread with a specific intent, right? It has some strategic value or objective that it's trying to accomplish. So really, they're oftentimes used synonymously, but that's the key distinction between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is just any information that could be spreading innocently, that is factually inaccurate, whereas disinformation is kind of more so describing the motive underlying the spread of misinformation. And again, in my own research and a lot of this conversation that's taking place around misinformation, we usually focus on the context of politics, health, and science. Right? These are the areas in which we see considerable amounts of misinformation plaguing public understanding, toxifying discourse, resulting in public health crises. As a consequence of people believing a lot of these things to be true when there's actually no support for them. But unfortunately, there isn't a lot of application of this literature to the context of business. But when I was thinking about this and I did a little bit of research on this, the potential disruptions of misinformation for the business sector is real. And so I provided a couple of scenarios that some of these I've come across, some of these I imagine myself. But for example, a video of a store associate using offensive language, specifically say if that were to occur during a busy shopping season, right, could be a tremendous impact on how consumers view your brand, could potentially lead to boycotts or other people concerned about whether they can come to your stores, feel safe being at your stores, feel that the stores have similar values to them. When it comes to employee-employer relations, right, there's the possibility where employees could spread doctored information to support a false claim of wrongful termination. This information could circulate, reach a broader audience, and lead people to question your employment practices. Or you could have situations in which some interested, perhaps politically motivated parties want to damage your brand in some way, say through some sort of fake promotion on some sort of politically charged issue. And the reason I wanted to conclude with that is this actually happened. This third example actually happened just a few years ago. And I think it's a pretty important cautionary tale to kind of show how quickly misinformation can kind of have an impact on the way in which your business operates and how it has to respond to this disruption in order to prevent any unnecessary damage. So back in 2017, 4chan, which is this very popular kind of image board, message board type of website. It actually has a strong appeal amongst certain segments of the population. The far right, for example, is very active on 4chan. Decided that they wanted to create some sort of fake promotion to target undocumented immigrants. And the idea behind this is their motivation was to harm liberal businesses. And in thinking about their potential targets, they chose Starbucks. Starbucks, which has had a past, of some situations in which specifically some have questioned their political correctness, specifically around their holiday cups. They said, this is a company that we want to come after. We want to try to damage them in some way. And ultimately what they concocted was this idea called Dreamer Day. And you may have heard about this a few years ago, but essentially what this whole thing, how it started, was again, through these people interacting on 4chan and creating false promotional materials. And here I've provided one example of this flyer that was circulating on social media back in 2017, which advertises this idea of Starbucks Dreamer Day. It came accompanied with a hashtag so that users could retweet it, use this hashtag, create some visibility for it, even had promotional codes that they could use in order to get additional discounts on beverages at Starbucks. And they chose this date of August 11th. So they did this largely just using basic photoshopping technology, did not require a great deal of sophistication here. But where things kind of started to spiral out of control is they did a very, very good job of amplifying their content. So they didn't just put this out there and share it a couple of times from their personal accounts. A lot of these users on 4chan created dozens of social media accounts. And this one specifically, this Maria Chavez, appears to be a real person. You see that they have a picture for a profile picture. This account was actually created 1 day prior to circulating these promotional materials on Twitter. They had only posted one time before they started putting out this content for border-free coffee, sharing these flyers. They did this for dozens of accounts to make it appear as if this was a real thing that people were actually talking about. And we call that amplification. And so as a consequence, many people started seeing this. People who were searching for Starbucks, who were clicking on this hashtag, it started to trend, it started to pick up momentum in certain communities, and thousands of people encountered this thinking that it was a real event that Starbucks was putting on. The attention that this started to generate on social media led to mainstream media attention. You started seeing news articles published, taking on this. They started to investigate this. Is this a real thing? And ultimately, they started putting out stories debunking the idea that Dreamer Day was an actual promotion being put on by Starbucks. But you started to see, again, time and effort and attention to be paid to this, to be given to this in order to push back against this claim that Dreamer Day was an actual event taking place at Starbucks. But I think most relevant for the discussion today, at least from my perspective, is it required a response from the brand. And here we have a politically charged controversy when we talk about immigration, an issue that generates strong reactions on both sides, where now Starbucks, because of this disinformation campaign, this promotion, this false promotion of Dreamer Day, had to come down and say something. And they had to take a delicate balance because they didn't want to alienate their consumers. They didn't want to come out too strong in saying that this wasn't real, because if they were to be too strong in that type of messaging, it could lead to a backlash from people who perhaps support the Dreamers, who support DACA. On the other side, however, if they came down too supportive of the Dreamers and of DACA, it could have that reverse effect, where now the other side is upset with the perspective that they took. As you can see from these tweets, Starbucks largely tried to stay as agnostic as possible politically in just saying that, look, this is misinformation. This is not real. And ultimately, they were pretty successful in pushing back. While it did generate a lot of attention at the start, the damage to Starbucks in the long term wasn't significant. But I think this is a cautionary tale because it can come to show how very quickly something can originate, spread, and require a response in a very short period of time. And if that response is not sufficient, the damage can be more profound. But another thing to note about this, though, is that even though this was 3 years ago, this was all very primitively done. Really, again, they relied on nothing more than Photoshop and fake social media accounts to bolster their content. But despite that, you see thousands of users come to believe that this is a real thing, sharing this hashtag, engaging around this issue, Dozens of news stories were written at both the local and national level to try to deal with this issue. So even though this really required minimal resources on the part of a disruptive few individuals on 4chan, the impact was disproportionately large. And so this is why this is concerning, that again, when we talk about today and the types of technology that is now accessible around, that could result in the spread of misinformation, now these impacts can be astronomically larger. And so I use this as a cautionary tale to kind of move into some of the specifics of what I want to talk about today, which is, why do people believe misinformation? What are the motivations? What are the psychological tendencies? What are the sociological factors that promote belief in misinformation? But I really want to spend a lot of time on the second point, which is how it's evolving going forward and how this fight is going to be even more difficult across sectors, whether it be in business, politics, or anywhere, because the technology is accelerating at a pace, I think, that's going beyond our understanding of what's going on. And then lastly, I want to talk about some of the potential consequences and what we can ultimately do and what you can ultimately do to try to mitigate any types of damage that can result from the spread of misinformation. So first I want to talk about why people believe. And there's a rich literature on this. A lot of research has been done trying to understand what are the factors, what are the forces that promote belief in misinformation. Some of these you may be familiar with, others less so. One of the main factors that's been found that predicts belief in misinformation is something called the confirmation bias. So the confirmation bias is simply, we tend to want to believe things that support our broader worldview. Even if they're factually wrong, if they in some way confirm our idea of what is real or what is good, what we value, we tend to be more willing to believe it. On the flip side, we tend to push back or resist information that tends to challenge our worldview. And so when we encounter falsehoods that promote in some way our overall way of thinking about the world, if we think, for example, that this company, this business is politically slanted one way or another, or tends to engage in certain types of activity, and then we encounter information that supports that worldview, we're going to be far more likely to believe it. And again, vice versa, we're going to push back against things that kind of challenge that worldview. Secondly, by default, humans trust others, especially in the interpersonal context. So what I mean by this is that we don't have the cognitive resources available to us at all times to investigate further, to think critically and deeply about the things that are being told to us. And this is why you see misinformation spread very quickly within social systems, right? Because people start sharing it, they start tweeting it, and it's not coming from faceless, nameless organizations or Twitter accounts. It's coming from people we know, people who we admire, people who we look up to, people that we trust. And so we kind of by default, because we don't have the ability, we don't have the motivation, we don't have the will to want to analyze and think critically about every piece of information we come across. Otherwise, we'd be almost paralyzed by analysis. We default to trust. And when we trust the types of content we're getting from people within our interpersonal networks, it increases the likelihood that we believe that information and also share it to others. Another psychological factor involves what's called accessibility or fluency. So accessibility is just how easy something comes to mind. How accessible is it in memory? Whereas fluency is defined by how easy it is to understand something. So things that, again, come to mind more easily or that are more easily understood, we tend to think more likely than not are true. And the number one factor that promotes both accessibility and fluency is exposure. The more we see something, the more we encounter a falsehood, the greater the likelihood it is that we're going to think that it's true, because it's both more accessible in memory, but the more you see something, the better able you are to understand it. So this is why it's important to get ahead of misinformation before it reaches a large audience, because if it's seen over and over and over and over again, the tendency is to believe it. We see it over and over, it must be true. I'm hearing it from all types of different sources, it must be true. And then lastly, people don't like uncertainty. It's very uncomfortable for us to be uncertain. We're always looking for information that can help us understand what's going on around us. I think this is very much explained at the moment, right, with COVID-19, right? There's so much that we don't know. We desperately want to be able to say with some certainty that we know something. And so we will gravitate to information that helps resolve that uncertainty. Even if it's factually inaccurate, if it provides us with a sense of security, with a sense of understanding, it reduces that uncertainty, we're going to be more likely to believe it. But beyond psychological factors, there's also a number of social factors that can promote belief in misinformation. One is group cues. So we all belong to groups, or it's human nature to want to belong to some collective. We look to those groups to guide our decision-making, our thinking, our understanding, what's good, what's bad. We also look to them to help us understand what's real. Right? We look to people within our social structures, within the groups with which we identify, to tell us that, hey, this is something that is real and we should pay attention to. This is something that's not. So we take cues from our groups in determining what's fact, what's fiction. But also we have a desperate need for belongingness. We don't want to be ostracized from the groups to which we belong. We want to share in the qualities that we think are desirable within our groups. And so oftentimes we'll express belief in things merely as a form of identity signaling, to show the people in our group that we're one of them. I believe this because I'm one of you. And so these are all factors that promote belief in misinformation. But the one thing I want to note here is that these things have always been the case. These are not new. We've known these things for decades. What is new and why misinformation is becoming a greater concern today is technology. In a sense, the size, scope, and speed with which falsehoods, with which misinformation can circulate is at a rate that we've never seen before. And I want to go over a few of these specific technological developments because I think it's important to kind of see what these can do and how they work. So there's a lot of talk about bots, and I'm sure you've probably heard about bots in the news and elsewhere. All a bot is a software program. It's a software program that is automated. It requires no management by some human user other than the initial creation of the program itself. And the way bots work is that they are oftentimes coordinated together so that if one account shares, for example, on social media, if one account shares or likes or retweets something or posts something, all of the other accounts that are coordinated with that bot will automatically do the same thing. So the example I have here were a number of bots that were programmed to be supportive of who was this? Mike Bloomberg, sorry, I apologize. Mike Bloomberg's presidential campaign. It was so long ago, I couldn't even remember his name. But these bots, these programs, these social media accounts were all linked together to share the same message advocating for Mike Bloomberg. And you can see they were all identical in form. They all had the same exact link. And as a consequence, this increases the likelihood of others encountering this message. This isn't a case necessarily of fake news, but you can kind of see how this works and how with misinformation, you can very quickly run into a problem that we call flooding the zone, where bots share something that's false. They all coordinate together. So you have thousands of accounts working as part of a strategic one. And as a consequence, anyone who's following any of those thousands of accounts are going to see that. So many people see it. Undoubtedly, some of them are going to believe it because you flooded the zone. People are going to get wet as a consequence of all the misinformation that's coming from these accounts. So this has really accelerated the spread. Bots do play a role in really pushing and amplifying misinformation on social media. Furthermore, commercial software has advanced to the point where editing content and making it look really convincing is really easy, even for the average internet user. And so the two pictures I have here are two things that I created for this exercise, for this presentation, that I just used a simple tool in Google Chrome to edit web content to say what I wanted it to say, right? The first one's meant to be humorous, but the second one we see with regards to Lowe's is I edited their personal protection policy to make it appear as if they were requiring face masks and that they would ask anyone who wasn't wearing one to leave, right? This is now entering into a politically charged moment, creating misinformation where there's no such policy. I'll be very clear about that for anyone who might be represented by Lowe's. But there's no such policy here. Lowe's does not require face masks. They ask that people wear them, but there's no requirement whatsoever. But I have now edited this, which could lead some people to see this and go, oh, I don't want to shop there because they're forcing me to do something that I don't want to do. Right? This is very convincing. It's using the exact same font, the exact same format as the rest of the content on this website. Oftentimes, the word we use to describe this is called cheap fakes. So cheap fakes are really just software editing that's very convincing It's not creation of new content. It's just kind of changing or manipulating what's existing, what's already out there in a way to make it say something or sound a certain way that it wasn't actually intended to. And again, this software is available to all of us, and it's very easy to use. But the one that's getting the most attention in recent years involves what's called deepfakes. And here I just wanted to show you, even though it's not a business example, ways in which deepfakes, how they work. So on the left, you have a picture of Putin. This was an actual reference video. This was a video that he actually had recorded. The second video was completely created using artificial intelligence software and pictures and videos that they used to create a composite of Vladimir Putin. You can't hear what they're saying, but in the two videos, they're saying something completely different. And this has been suggested by some to be a major challenge moving forward because it's very convincing, right? You can make it appear as if someone who didn't say something, who never made a comment of this sort, said something completely made up. And as a consequence of that, it's very, very hard for people to tell. At this point, usually if you present deepfakes, and I do this with my students every time I teach my course on misinformation, when you present deepfakes to people now, usually they can tell something is off. There's just something that's inhuman, there's something that's mechanical that they can pick up on by looking at these two different figures. But in a short period of time, 3-5 years from now, deepfakes could be a major concern unless there are some actual regulations in place or some sort of diagnostic software programs that will help us determine what has been manipulated and what hasn't. So these developments are creating a situation in which the threat of misinformation is very scary. It's becoming a more prominent threat and concern. And that these concerns are not limited just to democracy or public health, but also to business. Right? And so the types of concerns we are seeing from misinformation and how it can impact the business sector is, first off, it's very easy to see how misinformation can have damage to the brain or create damage to the brain. This was the entire intent behind this Starbucks Streamer Day promotion, right? It was supposed to hurt the image of Starbucks, to force them to have to take a position on a controversial political issue that could possibly lead to backlash among certain segments of their consumer base. But beyond that, when you see this type of content, if it's reflecting negatively on these companies, it could affect employee morale. They're now concerned that these companies perhaps are not sharing in their values. They're advocating for things that go against the things that they care about or that they find important. Obviously, this could lead to consumer boycotts, right? Which I think was the ultimate intent of the Starbucks Streamer Day campaign, right? That when people see this stuff, they believe it. Even though nothing of the sort ever happened, now they're angry. Now they want to take some sort of remedial action against the brand based on something that simply is not true. And the fact of the matter is that you could often imagine situations where this can be strategically timed. The release of, or the creation of disinformation campaigns, the release of misinformation can be specifically timed to be especially damaging. So for example, during the holiday shopping season, perhaps someone who is a competitor or someone who otherwise just takes exception or has some pent-up frustration with a certain brand could create a deepfake video of a store associate berating a customer. Maybe that never happened, but now it's out there, now it's being shared, and people don't know the difference between what's real and what's not. There was a presentation, the name of the presenter is escaping me, where he spoke about how a CEO could be shown doing something that they never did just prior to an initial public offering, and how that could be really damaging to that IPO as a consequence. So the concern is not necessarily that this type of information might have an effect overall, but it can be strategically timed to have a real effect at a certain moment. There's also a great deal of concern about what the widespread prevalence of misinformation might mean for how consumers make sense of their options, how they're determining which brands to go with, which companies to frequent, so forth and so on. Essentially, the concern here is that we're entering a post-truth era where no longer are we going to be able to trust what we see. That with so much misinformation out there, that's very hard to disentangle fact from fiction. It's going to get really difficult for users, for consumers who are seeking genuine, helpful information about what types of products they should use, what types of businesses they should go to and should shop at. And as a consequence, this could lead to a major regression in the efficacy of online reviews. Online reviews are a very important tool specifically for smaller businesses to get their reputation out there, to set the signal to consumers that we are a good company who does good work. Well, now if you have, again, and there have been situations of this already occurring where there have been bots that have been deployed on review sites, whether it be Google or Yelp. The idea is that they're putting out so much misinformation about these brands that no longer can people necessarily trust that those reviews are giving them any helpful information at all. And this is going to put consumers in a real difficult position in terms of making decisions. How are they then going to make good decisions about what they should do, where they should shop at, what types of products they should buy? And another concern that's talked about a lot is something called the liar's dividend. So again, this is related to the second point. With so much misinformation out there, especially as it becomes more sophisticated, it becomes more difficult to tell the real from the fiction. This can be used as a defense for people who actually engage in bad behavior. They can claim that this was all made up. Even if they actually did engage in the damaging behavior, in a sense, the information environment and the widespread of misinformation can result in them using this as an actual defense, that we didn't do that, that that's not real. And so actual bad behavior can go unpunished. When you see misconduct by corporations, by businesses, people who actually are acting out in ways that are negative, they may get away with it because now they can claim, and to some degree, they can claim reasonably that hey, that wasn't us, it wasn't real, that's been doctored, it's been changed. And now people will believe that because they recognize how complex this information environment is. So now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about solutions and kind of what types of measures can be taken to mitigate the potential threats of misinformation. And here's where a lot of my research has been focusing over the past 5, 6, 7 years, which is how we can construct strategies that successfully push back against misinformation. One thing I can tell you from this literature is that prevention is greater than correction. The reason this is the case is that once people believe something that is false to be true, once they believe misinformation, it is very hard to correct their beliefs. So what's more effective is getting people to stop, to verify, to spend some time thinking critically about the information they encounter before they formulate a belief. Because once they believe it, it's really hard to change it. Another thing that's really, really fascinating in this literature is that even if your company is successful at debunking a falsehood, is debunking misinformation, that misinformation can continue to have an effect on people's attitudes toward the brand, on their general opinions, even after it's debunked. And essentially, we call this the continued effect of misinformation, which is that we have now convinced you that that thing indeed was false, but that initial reaction you had to the misinformation doesn't completely go away. In a sense, the correction doesn't cancel out any impact of the misinformation on your opinions and attitudes. And so this is a reason to again, kind of support prevention, because even when we do get you to a more accurate place in your beliefs, that doesn't mean that those bad opinions, those bad attitudes have completely been washed away simply because you convinced us that we were initially wrong. And then lastly, swift response is key. This is important because, again, we talked about social media and how quickly things can spiral out of control once they get shared and retweeted over and over and over again. It's important to get out ahead of misinformation before it reaches a critical mass. Once it reaches a critical mass, misinformation can become self-sustaining, where the entire process by which it spreads and circulates within a social structure is entirely driven by the users, by other social media accounts. They're sharing it, they're retweeting it, they're liking it, and as a consequence, it continues to reach a broader and broader audience. So it's important to identify something right off the bat, to see it immediately and get ahead of it, because once it reaches that certain point, it's very, very difficult to reverse that damage. And so in terms of actionable types of things to think about moving forward, I came up with a couple of solutions, a couple of things that maybe will help jar your thinking about how we can prevent misinformation from becoming too much of a threat for our own businesses. First off, rethinking crisis communication. I know you're going to hear from people, Sean Turner, I know in a few weeks, who's much more schooled on the nature of crisis communication than I am. But crisis communication, generally speaking, is reactionary, right? You determine that something happened and then you take measures to reduce the impact of that thing that happened. Right? Something negative that reflects negatively on your brand, on your company, and then you determine using PR strategies, ways in which you can minimize any potential damage that results. But the problem is that that type of reactionary thinking may not be sufficient to deal with the threat of misinformation. Because again, once it's out there, once it reaches a certain audience, it's sometimes very hard to reverse that damage. And so crisis communication might be more advantageous to deal with the threat of misinformation by being more active at the beginning, identifying and monitoring potential threats. What are the types of gaps that exist in people's understanding of what you do that could result in a situation in which misinformation could introduce itself and cause real problems? But additionally, crisis communication might want to be more strongly linked to consumer engagement. What I mean by this is again, people, when they're uncertain, when they don't necessarily perhaps have a strong feeling toward the brand, this might be a situation in which they're more susceptible to believing misinformation about the brand. And so consumer engagement is a way to build up perhaps goodwill, to build up a sense of understanding, of mutual affection between the brand and the consumer. And as a consequence of that, they may be more willing to cut you a break. They may be more willing, when they see something circulating about your brand, to stop and think, okay, is this real? Should I verify this? Should I look elsewhere? Because again, that's an important prevention technique. If people are taking that measure on your own, it also reduces the amount of effort you have to do for damage control later on. Another thing that I've observed over many years of following too many brands on social media is that perhaps this is an area for growth also for corporations. And that is that social media to this point oftentimes focuses on branding. You know, kind of when I think of Wendy's a lot when I think about social media, right? That they've kind of created this witty, funny, entertaining brand. People are, you know, demonstrate positive affect toward the brand. You also see social media used for promotions, to some extent customer service and customer interaction. But perhaps social media needs to go beyond that. Perhaps when thinking about social media managers and how you're operating on social media, you need to think about, are the people who are staffed on our social media team equipped? Are they trained in the best practices to be able to respond to misinformation in real time? And the reason that that's so critical is that if every hour, every day that goes by before there is a response to something results in that many more people seeing it without the brand actually having an answer for it. And so having social media managers who are active in determining what's being said about us and also how to go about best practices to push back against any misinformation could be very valuable in terms of preventing the spread and preventing any potential damage. And then lastly, media literacy is one of the most important factors that we've identified in this literature. Training people how to basically be good consumers of the internet, good consumers of social media. In a sense, what has happened is that we've been bombarded with so much technology that many of us have been left behind in terms of how to make sense of it. But when we equip people with a certain basic media literacy, they're better at identifying the bad stuff. They're better at sniffing it out. They're better at knowing where to look for good information. And so I think this is a common cause that we should all get behind, not just in politics and public health, but business as well, that the better consumers of information that we create, the less that this is going to be a problem for all of us, right? We're able to train people to look and to be able to identify when things don't look right. That, again, is going to save us a lot of work on the back end in terms of trying to address and change people's perceptions after they've already formulated belief in misinformation. So that's all I have for today. And again, I thank everyone for being here. I thank everyone for inviting me for being here, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Dr. Carnahan. And if you're watching today, you're welcome to submit questions. We have several in the queue already to ask you. So I wanted to start with one that was from your last slide on moving forward. You gave some great strategies or action items we can add to existing strategies as we consider marketing campaigns, blog posts, posts on social. So the question is, how can a business or an organization look for false information about their company or organization as part of their regular scanning? So what do they look for?
So yeah, I think it's a good question. And the one thing I do want to note is that, you know, we tend to focus on those circumstances in which misinformation really came to reach a large number of people. Those are the exceptions. There's misinformation being circulated all the time, and a lot of it just fizzles out, right? And those aren't the ones you need to worry about, right? Those are the ones that are going to take care of themselves because they're just simply not going to reach an audience. But in terms of being able to identify those ones that are starting to bubble up and be a little bit more concerning, this is where, identifying hashtags, looking at your mentions, oftentimes when you see a disinformation campaign perpetuated against a brand or against a company or against whomever, they won't actually at the brand or the individual in the tweet. They will reference like Starbucks. And so going back to those slides I showed earlier, that troll account that created that Starbucks promotional ad Twitter post didn't put at Starbucks, but they did put the hashtag border-free coffee, right? And so that's where you need to be kind of focusing your efforts, right? Where are those ones that are starting to get a little bit of traction? You're seeing more mentions, you're seeing more of the use of those hashtags. And so really it's just, trying to be as attentive as possible. There are programs, and I'm not familiar in terms of how you use them, but who can do, for example, we call it data scraping, where you can use them on Twitter to kind of take a look at how your brand is being talked about. So any mention of your company, of your Twitter handle, of this hashtag, you can find on every day using these types of data scraping programs. Twitter's not a big fan of that. They don't like people doing that. But I mean, again, if you were very paranoid and concerned about how maybe there's information circulating around your brand that's untrue, that might be a way to try to identify what are those troubling claims, how common are they, who are they circulating among, and then you can start to really get a nice diagnosis of the problem.
And on the front end, what would you recommend to add to strategies to prevent disruptions like that?
I think just a very, very strong consumer engagement strategy. I think, again, I think the example, we were talking yesterday, Marcie, about Drew Brees, right? And Drew Brees' comments about, respecting the flag and how that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way with regards to the current protests going on. Right? He had built up a good deal of goodwill with a lot of people, right? He's very well respected, very well liked, even amongst his teammates and fans, so that they were willing, after he came out and made a follow-up statement, to just kind of, okay, we're done with this, right? And so I think that sends a signal. And, Drew Brees, even though he's an athlete, he has a brand. I think that kind of sends a good example. It sets a good example of how when you have a strong relationship with your consumer base, that they know you, they are familiar with the types of things that you engage on, they are familiar with what you stand for, that if something comes out, they may stop and think about it. They may spend more time researching it. And as a consequence, they're going to be less likely to jump to conclusions based on seeing some misinformed tweet. But B, even if they do believe it, they're going to cut you some slack, right? It's not going to be as impactful because they've developed this relationship with the brand over some period of time. And so I think that's one of the most important things that brands can do to kind of prevent the impacts of misinformation, is just having that strong consumer engagement strategy up front.
We're going to switch gears and talk about the media for a moment.
Sure.
One of the questions is that there exists a media bias chart assessing conservative versus liberal, fact versus opinion. Assuming you've seen this, what's your opinion on the validity of this?
So if it's the one that I'm thinking of, there have actually been quite a few put out, and this is actually, it's funny, you're tapping into my earlier research interest, which was selective exposure to political media content. So we do a lot of coding of media as either having a conservative or liberal slant. And if it's the one that I'm familiar with, I think it does a pretty good job. But the one thing that I always have to come back to people with is that there's a distinction between news and commentary that we oftentimes don't make when thinking about specific types of news outlets. When you look at news content across all different types of channels, oftentimes it's very similar. The news itself does vary. It does vary in terms of what types of stories get kind of front page treatment. But in terms of the content of the quote unquote news, there's not a great deal of variation across outlets. It's the opinion shows, it's the commentary where you see considerable divergence amongst news outlets. And so when you're looking at these charts that kind of try to track bias across different types of news outlets, the one thing that I always ask myself is what are they looking at? Are they looking at the content of the news itself? Or are they looking at the content of the commentary? Are they looking at the content of the opinion shows? Because again, you know, Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow, I would not call them news. Those are opinion programs. They are providing an interpretation of the news. But when you look at the actual news content, there's not a lot of variation.
Is there a source that you find most neutral for news?
Oh, yeah, good question. It depends on what type of news, right? If it's political news, I prefer things like The Hill, Politico. These are websites that have, you know, strong reputations for being kind of no-nonsense reporting. PBS NewsHour, nobody watches it, but it's PBS NewsHour. You know, it is a traditional. It almost like it's a time machine, almost, right? It sends you back to, you know, the news broadcasts of Ted Koppel and Peter Jennings and even back before that, Cronkite. But it's a very factually oriented news program that provides you mostly with just what happened, how it happened. And so if you're looking for good content there, those are a couple I would recommend. Also, I've always been fond on international news, which we don't cover a lot in the United States, on BBC. BBC News is usually a very, very nice outlet to get international perspective and what's going on in places that aren't here. But right now, I think we're all just overly consumed with what's happening here, I think for good reason. But when things return to normal and you want to know what's going on elsewhere, I think BBC is a good outlet.
Thank you. So we're going to talk a couple minutes about current and then looking into the future for the remaining questions. This question states, lately I'm finding an approach where something is circulated that's true, but out of context. With superficial research, the statement seems true. Politicians said ABC and XYZ. On deeper research, the very next sentence they said explained things and the meaning completely changes. Seemingly reputable outlets seem to be doing this on purpose. It seems so mainstream that it's not clear what and who to trust. Is this still viewed as misinformation?
So what was the question again? Sorry, I just want to make sure I answer it correctly.
Yep, it's talking about when things are true but they're out of context. Is that still classified as misinformation?
I think according to the most liberal definition of misinformation, yes. I would call that spin. And so, you know, and again, this is kind of why I wanted to say at the onset that the problem of misinformation is not new. As a matter of fact, when I teach my course on misinformation, we talk about the election of 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and how both of them were alleging things that were just completely unfounded. As a matter of fact, I think it was either Jefferson or Adams accused the other candidate of being dead as a reason to vote for them, right? I mean, and so the idea that this is new isn't, you know, it's wrong. Misinformation has been a problem. Conspiracies, disinformation have been a problem dating back centuries. But with regards to this specific kind of out of context statement, that reminds me more of political spin, right? Where you take some statement and you warp it and you change it so that the thing that was said is actually a thing that was said. But it's been decontextualized, it's been kind of run through the gamut, and the interpretation of it has changed in such a way that no longer is the thing that was said, no longer does it carry the original intent and the original meaning with which that statement was delivered. And so it's a very common tactic that you'll see in politics, right? Where someone will make a comment and then the other side will seize on that comment and will try to change the meaning of that comment for a political advantage. I think that's more so the category that falls in. But again, these are all very fluid concepts. I think misinformation is anything that's false, half true, unverified, unsubstantiated. So I think there's a way in which that could fit into that definition.
The next question relates to feedback farming. It says in the UK, there was a dispatches program that showed you can buy for and against feedback in any site, including Amazon, where the purchase has been verified. This reader or this viewer finds this very disturbing, as many people buy upon the feedback of others, which has a real effect on consumer purchase.
Mhm.
Given that we can't disentangle fact or fiction, then what's the alternative?
I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? I wish I had a fantastic answer for you. I think really the $1 million, I guess the solution, not the $1 million solution, but the solution is just to make people more aware of the types of um, more so deleterious consequences of online reviews and how these things might not signal what you think they're signaling, that there are ways in which these can be manipulated, there are ways in which these can be misused by some for purposes that are not sincere, right? And I don't necessarily know if there is one solution. I know with Amazon, they're doing this verified purchase thing. I know other people are other aggregators, other reviewers are saying that this person actually did go to this restaurant. But even so, right? I mean, who's to say that person didn't go to that restaurant with the intent of damaging that restaurant's brand? There's still things happening. There's still things that could be in play and shaping how people are using these types of online review services. So I think, again, it comes back to just making sure customers understand what these things actually are doing, what they actually mean. Maybe try to just convey to them to read these things with some degree of caution. Don't think that they're the end all be all. Just because something has a 5-star rating, it doesn't mean that that hasn't been created or constructed as a consequence of 1,000 bot accounts all giving that company a 5-star rating. Making them aware that that is a possibility then might lead them to do additional research on their own and determine whether or not that's what they want to do, that's where they want to shop, that's what they want to go with.
So in our current environment with responding to the pandemic and the other crises impacting business today, does ambiguity or absence of detail have a similar effect to misinformation?
Absolutely. I mean, when you have situations in which you have mixed messages, when things are one way today and a different way tomorrow, that all just contributes to stoking that anxiety in information consumers. And they will gravitate to anything that helped them get out of that state. And so usually when we talk about emotion in information seeking, we talk about anxiety, we talk about uncertainty, we call them negative drive states. And so what that means is that once we experience those feelings, we want to do everything within our capability of getting away from those feelings. And so if somebody comes along with a magic elixir that says, hey, look, COVID-19 is going to be resolved, right? Believing that will reduce your anxiety. It will reduce your uncertainty. You'll feel better as a consequence of that information. And that's why people will believe it. That's why people will buy things even without a lot of critical thought, because they're so desperate to get out of that ambiguous situation, to reduce that anxiety, that they'll believe something just because it makes them feel better. And on the other side, messengers know this, right? People who disseminate disinformation campaigns, they know this. And so they strategically look for those situations in which there is ambiguity or uncertainty or anxiety, and they play to those emotions, they play to those reactions in order to achieve their outcome. And so absolutely, ambiguity, confusion, conflicting statements, mixed messages, all these things create a situation where misinformation can become a much more bigger problem.
And to speak about the financial, or to consider the financial impact when your company or organization has been targeted, has there been any quantification of the financial impact? Have there been lawsuits for slander? What's been going on the end of a targeted attack?
So it's a good question. I'm not aware of anything that's really tried to quantify what types of financial impacts that companies or businesses have incurred as a consequence of disinformation campaigns. But I do know that legal recourse is an option. I'm not an attorney, I want to be very clear. But one thing that is a challenge for businesses and corporations who are trying to push back against misinformation, disinformation, especially with libel and slander, is that they have to prove that the burden is on them to prove that this was shared with reckless intent for the truth. And this is my understanding of it. I did a little constitutional law, a long time ago. But my understanding is that it's very easy for someone who's peddling misinformation and doing so intentionally to say, well, I didn't know that was false, right? That could be their defense. If they're sharing something innocently simply because they came across it on Twitter, right, it's very hard to say that that person, without a doubt, knew that this was false and was circulating this anyways. And so the types of libel and slander protections that exist for businesses are more so the people who originated the claim. And I know with, people who work in forensics online will tell you it's really hard to find out where something originated. It's very, very difficult to trace back and look at something that's around today and go back several weeks or months or years to find out where this claim actually started. And so that's a problem, right? That there is legal recourse, but I think it would be a pretty difficult case to make, given the burden of having to establish that this was something that was shared with reckless intent, that people knew the truth and they chose to share it anyway. But the financial impacts, I think that's a really, really interesting area of study. I'm surprised there hasn't been more on that. Maybe there has, I'm just not familiar with it.
So a future state question next for you.
Okay.
What's on the horizon? There's some chatter about blockchain and several other options for using technology to identify, prevent, etc. What's in the future for preventing inaccuracies? Yeah,
so I think there's a few things that have been happening, I think, in recent years that I think inspire some hope. One is that there have been efforts at creating bots for good, right? We talked about bots in a negative sense here, these software programs that kind of mindlessly retweet, share, create fake content. But there are efforts to create bots to spot and identify misinformation on social media networks and to immediately latch onto them, almost like a virus, but a good type of virus, right? Where when it sees content that is factually inaccurate, and it's been programmed to identify that it will then automatically reply to all of those tweets. And so that when you see the fake news tweet, when you see the misinformation, you will automatically see the bot saying, actually, this is false, right? You're seeing social media networks also starting to be a little bit more free in doing this. And there is a debate as to whether or not that's their proper role in society. But you are seeing, for example, things like vaccine denial. When things are being shared about vaccines on Facebook, they are attaching, warnings and labels to certain types of tweets as saying this is disputed, this is not something that is necessarily true. But to think that they'd be able to do that in a way that could be all encompassing for all types of misinformation, say things that might affect your businesses, I think would be unrealistic. As for the deepfake thing, I know that there are researchers on the West Coast, I want to say at Caltech or Berkeley, I can't remember where, but they actually have some really innovative software that allows allows people to determine, essentially, you just basically run the deepfake video through a program, and it will look for signs or any sort of evidence that this video has been doctored, has been changed in some way, that it's not real, it's not organic, there's something wrong about this. And so they are working to create technology essentially to push back against the problems that technology have created. And there's a lot of promise there, but I do wonder, essentially, is it gonna be enough, right? I don't want to end on too optimistic of a note, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I do think that really what matters is our role in this. I don't think we can rely on technology. I don't think we can rely on social media platforms to do all the work for us. I think it stands to reason that we have to take more responsibility for what we consume and what we share with others.
That's a great lead in. Those are the last two questions I had for you. First, what do you think social media organizations' role could be?
Okay, so my personal view, and I mean, I could get some pushback on that, and it's totally understandable, is I think they need to be playing a more active role. I think they created these forums to be open and to allow the free exchange of ideas, but I think the issue is that people aren't necessarily well equipped, and nor do they have the resources, I think is important to consider as well, to vet everything they read. And so I'm not saying that Twitter needs to be a purveyor of truth as much as Twitter perhaps should recognize, Twitter and Facebook should recognize the role that they are playing in society and take measures to ensure that whatever information is being exchanged is being done so responsibly. And so I do think that there is a role to play there. That being said, and this is a thought experiment I always put to my own students, is, you know, who's running Facebook and who's running Twitter? These aren't elected officials, right? These are people who are running corporations with the motivation of profit. There's nothing wrong with that. But the question is should we trust that they're going to necessarily make the best decisions for the quality of the information environment, given they're also motivated to be profitable? And so I don't know if I'm terribly confident with too much faith, I guess, being placed in social media outlets to do all the heavy lifting. And again, I think that kind of comes back to the point of a lot of it falls on us. A lot of it just has to start with us being smart about what we're consuming, not jumping to conclusions, verifying things that we're unsure of, and just being responsible generally.
Another good lead-in, because that was the second question. As I listen to you, I'm very motivated to do a lot of research, figure out where we are vulnerable, shore up those gaps, and also add some preventative measures. And I see questions that reflect that you have motivated many of the people listening with similar thoughts. So how do we do that? What resources are there for social media managers or for executives that want to learn more about this so that we can create and enhance our current strategies?
Yeah, so in terms of resources that are out there, the one thing I'll say that's a little unfortunate is there's not a lot. I
don't like that answer. Let's rewind a little.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that this is kind of a novel problem. And I think, you know, especially, and I can speak really to the political, kind of the solutions that are being implemented politically, where I'm familiar with people that are working with campaigns that are having entire meetings around this very question, right? And so they are orchestrating a strategy to, if this happens, what will we do? And they're using, you know, all the research that they have available to them to kind of work through these kind of hypothetical scenarios to determine what would our response be. And so I guess from my perspective, I think that could be easily applied to the business sense, right? In a sense, it's similar to what you would expect a small town to do in response to a potential crisis, where you have these simulations, where you say, okay, if this were to happen, what would our playbook look like? What would be our responses? Okay, our first response is this, our second response is this, our third response is this. And so if I were advising businesses who are serious about kind of being able to counteract the threat of misinformation, I think that's where I would start, is to go through and kind of understand the literature, know what the research says about what types of messages are most likely to work. You know, when should we be concerned? How do we not unnecessarily provide an amplifier to the falsehood in trying to push back against it? So what are the different things that we can do, and how do we do them in a practical sense? I think that is where I would start. But in terms of, I mean, I know of some people who work as consultants in this field, that they're brought in to talk to social media teams and communication teams about how we can do this. But there isn't, I don't think there's a grand strategy, I guess, is kind of what I'm trying to say. And I think you're even seeing that the health communication scholars, the politicians, they're all in the same boat where this is relatively new. And I don't think they've determined how to play it. I don't know if they figured out necessarily the best, the complete best way to respond. What's going to work, what isn't going to work. And so if I had to make a suggestion, it would be to put together that playbook, starting with, if this happened in this scenario, what would be the series of steps that we would take to try to do everything we could to mitigate the damage.
Thank you. That's great advice. And I think that, in addition to you today bridging the gap with your research and applying it into a business setting, certainly opened a lot of eyes and gave a lot of in-depth information for those of us that are in a slightly different world than yours. So thank you very much. As we wrap up today, we have just a short amount of time. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share as we wrap up?
No, I'm just very, very thankful that you guys had me on. Again, I remember when you asked me to do this, I was like, why do you want me to talk? I think after thinking about this and exploring it more, I mean, there's a number of important applications that transcend any discipline. That, you know, we're going to see this, this problem, I think, become a problem everywhere. And maybe into different degrees, but I think it's important that we're all engaging around this and thinking about how all of us can do better. And I think one consequence of that is if we're all attacking this from different angles, you know, we might have a better chance of really creating better informed, more critical information consumers. It's ultimately going to benefit everyone in every domain, whether it be health, science, business, politics, wherever. And I think that's something that I'm hopeful for because I think we got our work cut out for us. And I think the more people that are attentive and aware of this problem, the better.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so glad you agreed to do this. There's some clear implications in the business world that I think we've created some awareness on a new issue in the business world. So thank you very much for being so generous with your time and for speaking today. For those of you that are watching, we're wrapping up today. We have more webinars for you. So the schedule is visible on the screen as well as available on our website. So we will see you next week, hopefully. Take care.